Welcome to Philanthropy and Aging Services. We're so thrilled that you took time out of your busy days to be with us for our presentation, a watershed moment in aging services fundraising called Philanthropy and Aging Services. Thank you in particular for taking time out of your day, given the ongoing national struggles with COVID-19. I'm going to pause for just a second and allow others to join us. Again, thank you for being with us today for Philanthropy and Aging Service, the first national benchmarking study of its kind tracking philanthropic trends in the United States. My name is Cedric Richner. I am the practice leader for the Aging Services component of Marts Lundy. And with us today are an esteemed group of panelists who are going to present our national benchmarking study. And I want to make a special note that given the large number of attendees today, we've muted participants in order to limit background noise, but we want to hear from you. So please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. I'll be monitoring those questions as we go through the presentation. The webinar will also be recorded, and we will send a link of the recording as well as the full report and the slide deck by the end of the day, Thursday. We hope that you'll share this important information with your colleagues, the CEOs of your organizations, board members, your colleagues in the sector. We also invite you to reach out to us personally following the webinar, and we will be providing contact information for that purpose. Again, my name is Cedric Richner, and I'm the head of the Aging Services Practice Group at Marts Lundy. I'm actually wearing two hats today. The first hat is, as I just described, as a member of Marts Lundy, but the second hat I'm wearing is also a member of the Editorial Review Board for this very important study. And now I'd like to mention those people who have guided this entire process along the way with us, our Editorial Review Board. As you can see, it represents a cross-section of industry leaders representing both continuing care retirement communities / life plan communities and other kinds of communities throughout aging services. So without further ado, the big moment has arrived. This has been more than 2 decades in the making, and I wanted to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Harris, from Marts Lundy, who is also a co-editor of the philanthropy report. Co-presenting with her today will be Irina Thompson from our Marts Lundy team in our Aging Services Practice Group, as well as David Matson, who is the Chief Development Officer for Sequoia Living and a member of our Editorial Review Board. So with Kate, can I turn it over to you for the big moment of reveal?
Absolutely, Cedric, and thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's really great to see so many friends and colleagues joining us today for this release of the report. I also want to extend my gratitude to everyone who served on the Editorial Review Board. Your insights and ideas really helped to make this report what it was. And for those of you who will be downloading the report later today, you'll see quotes and tips and insights from many of these frontline fundraisers that help to kind of bring some of this data to life. So we're really excited to share that with you. I also want to thank the staff that made this possible, especially my co-editor, Irina Thompson. A lot of hours have gone into this, so thank you. And finally, thanks to the 41 organizations that participated in this study. We could not have provided this to you without their participation, so thank you to all of you. I know many of you are on the call today, and we're just really grateful that you're here. I know all of you are eager to access the report, so by way of some quick housekeeping, you'll receive an email later today with a link to download the full report. You'll also get access to an expanded version of the slide deck that we're sharing with you today. We certainly encourage you to use that, share it with your boards, volunteers, leaders, donors. It's really a resource for you to use, as is the content of the report. So please visit our website. You can check back there. We're going to be doing a lot more research throughout the year. So please, make sure to follow Marts Lundy and keep track of some of the great research that's coming out of, especially this insights section. I want to start off just by explaining a little bit about why we conducted this study in the first place. Many of you know that the research on fundraising and aging services has been a bit scarce until now. The most prominent studies that we could draw from were things like a really wonderful report that came out from the Giving Institute called Giving in the Golden Years, definitely worth reading. That work was building on research that we partnered with Leading Age Virginia to produce the 2017 Leading Age Virginia Philanthropy Benchmarking Study. But so aside from the obvious need for more research, why bother with this study? Like many of you, in our practice, we have found over the years that due to the uniqueness of aging services, some of the best available fundraising advice just doesn't apply to your organizations. For example, it's not uncommon for CEOs of nonprofit organizations to devote a majority of their time to fundraising. Think college and university presidents, for example. It's often quoted as a best practice, but we know in aging services, that's not a reasonable expectation for CEOs or executive directors. But they still have a role to play. And what is that role? What's normative in the sector? How do we set reasonable expectations for leadership that align with peers and leaders in the field? These and many other questions we get all the time. And after 22 years of consulting in this sector, the Aging Services Group at Marts Lundy, formerly Richner & Richner, felt the sector had reached a level of maturity that warranted a national study. We've talked about this sector, fundraising in this sector being in its infancy. And one of our editorial review board members, I think, put it the best, which was, maybe we've now moved into childhood or even adolescence. COVID has presented unprecedented challenges, painful losses that have touched many of us, including myself personally. And it has also, though, shined a spotlight on older adults like never before. And many of us have seen, and like many of you in the field, have reported record fundraising years in 2020 because of the generosity that often comes with a crisis. And so what we're so excited about with this report is that not only can we offer regionally based benchmarks, and benchmarks for aging services fundraising overall, we can differentiate between multi-site and single-site residential organizations and the real differences between those that operate under a departmental model and those that have a sole supporting foundation. So if, like those of us on the call today, you have been inspired by the older adults who, especially this year, have creatively embraced technology to stay connected, or hosted video conference tutoring sessions with the children of the frontline staff who are there to care for them, like our friends at Asbury, or have had residents that really dug deep and made philanthropic contributions to make the margin of excellence at many of your organizations possible. No group is more deserving of the information that can help to inform successful, ethical, and meaningful engagement with philanthropy at our organizations. So I want to introduce you to the data, and then Irina is going to talk through it in some more detail. We sent out a survey and we had 41 organizations respond. They are representing both multi-site and single-site organizations. Because there are multi-site organizations included in here, this data set actually represents 225 individual communities in 26 states. All the organizations that were surveyed do serve older adults and provide some form of residential services. Most are life plan communities or continuing care retirement communities and provide some continuum of care. but not all of them serve independent living residents, for example. So there's a decent amount of diversity in the data set that we haven't had before. And in terms of when this data was given to us, these are numbers that were reported for fiscal years that began as early as March 2018 and ended as recently as April 2020. So this is really some fresh data. And it's worth noting at this point that we do plan to repeat this study. So if you were not one of those 41 organizations that participated this time, please stay tuned. We'd love for your suggestions and involvement in the future. In terms of representation in the data, just want to point out briefly, the data set is split about 50-50 between single site and multi-site organizations. As you'll see later on, there are some differences there. In terms of sole supporting foundations versus departmental models, certainly there were more respondents that operate under a sole supporting foundation model, but we were still able to slice and dice that data and give you some key insights depending on how your fundraising program is set up. And then lastly, we discovered another way to segment the data, which was organizations raising under and over $1 million. While this may seem somewhat arbitrary, there really are some key differences between small shops and big shops. We don't want to give the same advice to an organization with annual revenue of $250,000, which is true for one of the survey respondents, as well as an organization that just completed a $27 million campaign. So this really helps us have that conversation in a more targeted way. And I think you'll find that you'll be able to kind of see how your organization fits in to the data set. So in terms of how your organization might measure up against some of the benchmarks that you'll find in the report, we look at two key metrics for this. One is return on investment. The other is the cost per dollar raised. This is a metric that we've been studying for years. The nonprofit sector looks at this for organizations overall. Generally speaking, a healthy cost per dollar raised is somewhere between 15 to 35 cents on the dollar. If you recall some of our previous studies, for example, in Leading Age Virginia, the median cost per dollar raised there was 21 cents on the dollar. In this most recent data set, for all the organizations that responded, the median cost per dollar raised was 24 cents on the dollar. But when we excluded organizations that either did not have revenue above costs to report, so if we only include those who are revenue positive, that median cost per dollar raised is 33 cents. I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, but what I want you to take away from this, and I think what's important for the sector to understand, is that there really is a healthy range. And what we're arriving at is a healthy range specific to aging services. And based on the research that we've done, including this most recent report, that is likely somewhere between 20 cents to 33 cents on the dollar. So something to take note of. As I mentioned, we were able to slice and dice the data and provide a little bit more specificity for the different models that we see out there in aging services. For example, foundations. We did find some differences between organizations that operate a sole supporting foundation. Overall, you'll note that the costs were generally higher. Those programs were generally larger than organizations operating under a departmental model. But I think the key takeaway here is that we also see higher net returns. And so there's a lot more in the report about the foundation model versus the departmental model, but something to consider specifically if you are looking to change the model under which you fundraise. The other thing I mentioned earlier was organizations raising under and over $1 million. We did find this to be a critical threshold for the sector. There's a lot of programs that are just starting out, that are just in their infancy, and we should have a different set of expectations for them. We know that it takes some time to build a program to one that really has the kinds of returns, that kind of cost per dollar raised that we might be advising clients on, for example. And so when we pull out organizations that raised over $1 million, what you'll see is that for overall, for organizations, the return on investment was about 2.24 times. But when you look at organizations raising over $1 million, it jumps to 3.48. And this is significant because it's a marker of maturity in a program. And so if you're trying to figure out kind of where your program fits in all of this, that's certainly one thing to take into account. I'm going to take a quick break from all the numbers and the data here for just a minute to breathe a little bit of life into this conversation. I am really excited to be presenting today with our friend and colleague, David Madsen from Sequoia Living. As many of you know, Sequoia Living is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a multi-site life plan community with a soul supporting foundation. They have 3 CCRCs, a 4th actually that just opened, serving 1,000 residents, 3 affordable housing communities with about 1,000 residents, a manufactured home community with 200 residents, 2 walk-in senior centers, as well as a host of other services for older adults in the San Francisco Bay Area. So David, welcome.
Thank you, Kate. It's great to be here. Sorry about that pause.
That's okay. I'm really glad you're here too. Well, David, we have some questions for you, and I really appreciate you sharing your insights. You have deep expertise in fundraising, but this has been your first stop in aging services. Tell us what makes fundraising and aging services so unique.
Well, I've worked in medical fundraising and university fundraising, and in those groups we have, alumni and grateful patients. And much like that at Sequoia Living, I think of our residents as our alumni and our grateful patients. What was really distinctive about senior services and aging is the sense of community that exists within our communities. I mean, people care about their neighbors, and they want to help their neighbors, and they want to enhance the quality of life for everybody in their community. And it's that sense of community that is really distinctive, as well as the proximity. I mean, the ability to just walk across the street and into one of our communities, or take a short drive into one of our communities and meet people in their homes, meet people over in the dining rooms, walk with people on the grounds. I mean, the ability to interact with people both, in a planned sense as well as in a very spontaneous way is really, really distinctive to this sector.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about the intimacy of the relationships in this sector. Many of you who are frontline fundraisers, your office is down the hall from someone's private home, and that creates some interesting and unique things. 2020 was a challenging year, but I know we all learned a lot and had a lot of successes. What are some of your takeaways from the last year, David?
Well, despite COVID, and despite the wildfires in Northern California, and despite all the politics going on in our country, it was that sense of community, people coming together. The pandemic really galvanized people in a really new way. And for example, one really striking example of that was our CCRC residents, who are predominantly, upper income individuals, know about our affordable communities and know we have these communities that serve low-income older adults. And right at the outset of the quarantine, they were concerned about their neighbors down the street, across town, who live in affordable communities, who wouldn't be able to get out to go grocery shopping and don't have the dining services that they have at the CCRCs. So we came together and we developed a plan working with our dining services partner, Marts Lundy, and our residents to deliver 1,000 bags of groceries every week for the first 13 weeks of the pandemic for that initial shelter in place. And the residents in the CCRCs donated their money, and they also volunteered to actually pack the groceries that the More Than Living delivered to the CCRCs, and then transported them to the affordable living communities. And that went on for 13 weeks, of 1,000 bags of groceries a week. And it was really such a special moment for the community to bring people together and help their neighbors in need. It was it really galvanized the entire community. And that was really just one example of the success we had last year, which was really an abundant year for us, much more than I would have expected under the circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, David's story is not uncommon for many of you. We did some research in the spring last year, and we really found that, some organizations were uncomfortable continuing their fundraising activity because maybe they didn't have as mature of a program, or it wasn't really ingrained in the culture yet. But for those organizations that were able to pivot, make a really strong case for why they needed to direct special funds to something now, like David, in your example, groceries for low-income residents. Those kinds of things really did pull the community together. And what we tend to find is that, this is a relationship-based business, the business of fundraising. This is about people. And so when, there is a crisis, people really remember how they were treated during that crisis. And so all of you who reached out, stayed in touch with your donors, we're already seeing some of the returns on that effort. So good for you. Last question, David. So, here we are, it's 2021. We have this brand new report with some great benchmarks and data to help inform decision-making. What are you looking forward to in 2021? Where do you go from here?
Well, I'm so excited that the vaccines are happening. Our communities the vaccinations are in process. We all can't wait till the day where we can meet with people together, to meet with them in their apartments, in their homes, in the dining rooms, to walk with them on our grounds. Everyone's looking forward to that, and throughout the organization, and the residents are excited. The staff are really excited. I'm looking forward to that opportunity to visit with people. Really, there's so much goodwill that exists now within our communities. That's always been there, but it's really heightened now. People are just so grateful for the care they've received, the safety that they've been provided, and I think there's going to be a real momentum coming out of the pandemic that's really going to, really create a very abundant atmosphere for fundraising, and really, I think, will propel us into a new way of doing things, and a new, achieving new levels of giving, because of that sense of community that people have and wanting to help their neighbors.
Absolutely, David. We've said this before, but there has been a spotlight on older adults like never before. And particularly those communities that have done pretty okay over the last, 10 to 11 months. There really is a strong case to be made for the nonprofit difference, for being a part of a community of older adults as well as staff, because we know that working in this sector means really being part of the sector in a meaningful way. And so, David, thank you for all of the work that you and your colleagues are doing at Sequoia Living. It's really inspiring to the rest of us, and I appreciate you being part of the conversation today.
Well, thank you, Kate, for inviting me and for the opportunity to participate, and the chance to wear a tie for the first time in a few months.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Well, I am, with that, going to pass it off to my co-editor, co-conspirator, Irina Thompson, to talk you through some more detail in the data. So, Irina, off to you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your day to join us today. We're so excited to dive into the data. Before I go too far along that route, I did want to remind everybody that as we're going through this information, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A feature. Cedric is in there and moderating those questions. We're also going to have some time at the end of this webinar to address the questions that are coming up in a panel format, so please don't be shy. today. I think one question that has come through that I did want to clarify is that all of the data that this study is built on comes from nonprofit organizations. So Kate mentioned the nonprofit difference that fundraising allows. So all of this is built on information coming directly from nonprofits. If that doesn't answer your question, please don't hesitate to pop back into the Q&A and we can get more specific. I did also want to mention that what we're sharing with you right now is the highlight reel from the report. When you download the full report itself, there's going to be a lot more in there, particularly in some of the distinctions that Kate has already talked about between supporting foundations versus departmental models, for example, also between results that we're seeing at multi-site organizations and single-site organizations. So again, this is just the highlight reel that we're talking about. So I do want to spend a couple moments talking about the how of the results that we're seeing. And one of the really striking data points that we saw when we got deep into the analysis was the prevalence of campaign fundraising. So 77% of our responding organizations indicated that they are either actively in campaign mode right now or have completed a campaign within the last 5 years. So we're seeing this sector maturity where really aging services is moving in similar directions to the kind of fundraising that we've seen happening in higher education for a couple of decades now, where if you're not actively in a capital campaign, you're probably planning for your next one. And that has that'll have some repercussions down the line that you'll see. But even with the campaign goals that have been reported, there's such a wide range of the kind of work being done in aging services. So, you know, we had minimum reported campaigns of $140,000 all the way up to $35 million. So there's a lot of variance across what organizations are doing within capital campaign fundraising. We also saw soaring endowments. So when we did the Leading Age Virginia study just 3 years ago in 2017, only 10% of those reporting organizations shared that they had endowments, and there was a median invested amount of about 3.5 million in that study. So in those 3 short years, we saw a whopping 81% of past respondent organizations report that they are now holding endowments with a median of about $8.1 million invested. So there is a shift in focus on long-term and sustainable fundraising results with this much deeper emphasis on endowments with just a couple years in between the data. I want to talk a little bit about where the funds are going also. And based on what I just shared about the prevalence of capital campaign fundraising, this chart may not be that surprising, but I do want to indicate a shift. When we did, again, that Leading Age Virginia study, benevolent care was the top dog of fundraising priorities in aging services organizations. We've since seen capital needs surpass benevolent care to take that top spot. As Kate mentioned, the data that we analyzed ended at the latest in spring of 2020. So the information that you're seeing here doesn't take into account the extraordinary impacts of COVID-19. So as we review data in subsequent surveys, it'll be interesting to see, I think, particularly whether employee scholarship and support jumps up in this priority ranking. As we know anecdotally from talking with many of you over the course of the last 10 months, that has been a very significant priority area for much of your donor base. I want to talk about what that donor base looks like as well. So this is really in concert with the trends that we're seeing from annual Giving USA data, where individuals, unsurprisingly, make up a dominant share of the aging services prospective donor base. Residents in particular are coming in with a factor of 4 to 10 times more giving than any other group. If we could move to the next slide. a metric that we developed to help organizations compare across different geographies, across different organization sizes, is net revenue per independent living unit, for those of you that do have independent living units. And across all organizations in the past data set, we saw this number jump up to over $2,500 of net revenue per independent living unit. In prior studies that we've done, including Leading Age Virginia, that number hovered at about 1.6 thousand and 1.8 thousand when we looked at publicly available data from 990s last year. So what is likely emerging, as Kate has already pointed out, like with the cost to raise a dollar, is a healthy range for organizations to target, depending on the age, the maturity level, the staffing level of its fundraising program. And it's looking like that range is going to fall somewhere between 1.5 thousand per independent living unit to 2.5 thousand per independent living unit. We also looked at board giving, and about 2/3 of responding organizations reported the gold standard of 100% board giving. And we did ask folks to report on their primary fundraising board. So for sole supporting foundations, or for those operating under a sole supporting foundation model, that would typically be the foundation board. And for the organizations that did meet that gold standard, you can see in the table below that the net revenue was significantly higher than organizations that didn't reach that. And we feel that that speaks to the buy-in that comes from having your top leadership be really in support of a robust fundraising program. I want to talk about staff deployment as well. This was something that we get a lot of interest in from our clients. So it was a question we made sure to include in the survey. So unsurprisingly, staff reported allocating a majority of their time to major and planned giving, which typically yields significantly high returns. The sector as a whole has a little bit more reliance on event-based fundraising than we see with other sectors, and commensurately less with focused on grants. You see that's just 6% there. We had a question come in as part of the registration process asking about institutional funders and whether they're giving to aging services organizations. And of the several reports that I've seen over the last handful of years, I've seen that number pegged anywhere between 1% and 3% of particularly foundations supporting aging services causes. So I think that's where you're seeing the commensurately low staff focus on grants, is because the funders just haven't become aware of the sector yet. One of the things that I personally will be looking for in subsequent years of data is whether the focus on the sector in 2020 as a result of COVID-19 leads to any shift in institutional funder awareness. Similarly, when we looked at the investment in fundraising staff and the returns that yields, I wanted to draw all of your attention to the bottom middle column there. When we looked at the net median return for every staff member, for every full-time employee that was dedicated to fundraising, that meant an extra $372,000 going back toward the organization. So we know many of you are having conversations with your board, your executive leadership, your CFOs, your CEOs, your executive directors about the costs of fundraising. It's a people-heavy department, and we know that that can be expensive. But what this data is really showing us is that the investment is a fruitful one. And I would be hard-pressed to find other service lines where you see this kind of really robust return on that investment. And I'd like to kick it back to Cedric in just a minute here, but I've thrown a lot of numbers and statistics at you over the few short minutes that I've been speaking. So I want to zoom out just a little bit and talk about some of the main points that struck us as we were in conversation with the editorial review board after we did the data analysis. And the things that really stood out were the 4 that you see on your screen. So the soaring growth in capital campaign popularity, and commensurately that capital projects have now overtaken the top fundraising priority for many of the organizations that we work with, as well as respondents to this survey. I'm going to point us back to that $372,000 net revenue per fundraising employee. The data has clearly demonstrated that investing in fundraising staff, as well as in board leadership and their commitment to fundraising, yields significant returns for the organization. And lastly, that residents continue to be at the very core of prospective donor bases for aging services organizations. And so with that, I'll kick it back over to Cedric, who will open up a quick poll and then lead us through the discussion questions.
Thanks very much, Irina. And just to put a fine point on what you were just saying about staff investment and the value to organizations for investing in staff. 6 or 7 years ago, I was honored to serve on the philanthropy cabinet for Leading Age, a cabinet that Larry Minix appointed for the purpose of studying philanthropy and aging services. And at that time, we did a similar study of leading age member organizations nationally. And at that time, it showed about $336,000 per FTE related to fundraising. So what we found in this study is not anecdotal in that regard. So it was corroborated by an earlier study. So that's a very exciting finding that we believe that you can take to your CFOs who aren't always fully understanding of the value of fundraising, your CEOs, and again, your boards. Thanks again, Irina, for sharing the information that you just did. Kate, for your presentation. David, really appreciate the testimonial from the field about what's really happening on the front lines. We would like to do a little bit of an Insta poll here about what Irina just presented related to what we believe are some of the 4 key takeaways. But what we're really curious about is what not only what are you taking away from this study, but also how you would kind of rate and rank the 4 things that we thought were most impactful. And so you'll see on your screen right now the opportunity to weigh in on this, and we'd love to have your feedback, and that should help us foster discussion in our remaining 23 minutes or so. We want to make sure that we have the opportunity for robust discussion through the panel. So again, continue to please submit your questions via the Q&A. I'm going to pause for just a second and give you an opportunity to interact with our poll. You know, it's very exciting for those of you on this Zoom call today to know that we have many dozens of people nationally participating in the session today, which is really exciting. And my colleague, Lori, I don't know if we're ready for the big reveal, but maybe we can populate the poll results and see what's happening here. Terrific. This is really exciting information. And it's thanks so much for participating in our poll. So why don't we go ahead and start a little bit of discussion now based on the poll results and what we're all learning and sharing today. And as Irina mentioned earlier, a number of questions came in even prior to the session today. Where I'd like to kick things off today is if you could all comment. Actually, Kate, why don't I tee you up as our first respondent here? And what I'd like to ask is, on this question of staffing, oftentimes it's an uphill battle for professionals in the field to make the case for adding staff. Certainly, these survey results provide a a powerful tool, if you will, for advocacy. But are there other things that you've observed over the years that are helpful in terms of fundraisers building the case for the power of philanthropy?
Absolutely, Cedric. And I think David might have some thoughts on this too, as he's had the opportunity to, talk with donors this year, talk with residents this year. We've heard numerous examples of fundraising staff who really leaned into the crisis over the last year. Maybe put down their fundraising database for a moment and helped to deliver meals or take temperatures at the door. And what we have found is that while those are not fundraising activities, and while we certainly advocate for efficiency, I think it strongly makes the case that this is about relationships. You cannot build relationships with one signature event and a newsletter, right? There's a lot of you still in the field who are wearing multiple hats in fundraising. You're in charge of marketing, and maybe you do some resident engagement activities. And oh, by the way, we've heard that this fundraising thing is kind of popular. Maybe you can take that on too. And, it really has to do with your aspirations for your program. If you want fundraising at your organization to be a club, kind of like there's a bridge club, there's a knitting club, right? Maybe there's a philanthropy club. That's great, and you can let residents engage in that in whatever way they want. But if you're inspired by some of the data that we've shared, or some of the leaders in our sector, many of whom are on this call today, who are really doing phenomenal things, expanding access to really high quality memory care services, for example, for people that can't afford them, bringing in really innovative technology that's changing what aging looks like. If you want fundraising to be part and parcel of what your service delivery looks like, the margin of excellence in your organization, as there's more and more baby boomers reaching retirement age, there is for-profit pressure coming in to the marketplace. If you really want fundraising to be a differentiating factor in your community, you have to invest. And we have found that typically there's a 3-year on-ramp to getting back the benefits of that investment. But we've also seen things turn around in a really short amount of time. And, so I do think it's worth exploring what's right for your organization, engaging residents in that conversation, because they want to be treated by your foundation or by your fundraising department with the same high quality and care that they receive from other service lines in your organization. So if you're providing extremely high quality care, you should be providing an extremely high quality donor experience. And I think that's what residents are looking for.
Wow, that's terrific, Kate. Really, really helpful. And David, as a deeply experienced fundraising professional who's newer to the sector, I'm just curious if you have anything to add regarding what Kate was just saying.
Well, having this data certainly helps make the case to the CEO. I know we have a new CEO, and I know this year, 2021, is really going to be the year of recovery. And then 2022 will be the year of expansion. And so for myself, in our organization, it was just fortuitous that right before the pandemic, one of our staff people resigned and moved away. And her job was to do the annual gala. Well, there was no gala this year. There won't be a gala in 2021 because we just don't know what's going to happen. And quite honestly, I've already told the CEO I'm hoping to sunset the gala. And we can now fill that vacancy and redeploy that in a way that's going to be more effective for fundraising purposes within our current budget, because the position is already there. It's just been vacant. And then that will position us for 2022 to actually build on and add more positions as well. So the data in this report will be very helpful, to making the case.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So we have a question that is one of the things that's very near and dear to my heart in 2 dimensions. The question is about benevolent care. And we know that for decades, benevolent care has been the dominant fundraising priority at organizations that were even engaged in fundraising. And now this study seems to show, it does show, the rise in the popularity of other kinds of fundraising programming across organizations. Some people who really care deeply about benevolent care can view that as a real threat. Those people who love benevolent care really love it. So how do you navigate that kind of transition when benevolent care has been dominant, but maybe the CFO or the CEO or the fundraising staff team does want to do a capital campaign? I'm going to open up the floor for comments about that very important question.
Well, I'll start and pass it off to my colleagues. Please make no mistake, anecdotally in the data, our perspective is that benevolent care is not going away. Benevolent care, and capital campaigns are also not robbing benevolent care of a fixed pie. Irina made a great point about the growth in endowments. And what we've seen is that, the pie is growing. That's what's happening. More people are getting involved in this. More people are seeing the ways in which their giving can transform an organization and really impact the mission. And so where we find the most successful fundraising programs are where there's a really strong understanding of that fundraising is a marriage between two things. And one of those is the interests and the passions of your donors. And the other is a legitimate mission-aligned need that your organization has. And when you can marry those things together, that's when you raise the most money. And the only way to know what your donors, what your residents care about is to talk to them. They may have dismissed the foundation for the last 10 years because you've only talked about benevolent care. But if you sat down and got to know them, you might hear that they were a preschool teacher for 35 years, and they're really excited about your new daycare that you're bringing online, and so maybe some scholarships that you're going to be offering to staff to bring their children to your on-site daycare. There's an opportunity for a conversation with a donor who is interested and engaged, and there may be a match with a need that you have. You only learn that through dialogue and conversation. And again, this business is about people. It's about their passions, and finding that alignment between, your organization's mission and something that people care about. And Irina, I know you have thoughts on this too.
I do. So as a frontline fundraiser, I had an assumption that at least a third of the people that I was going to be talking to might have absolutely no interest whatsoever in philanthropically supporting the organization that I'm fundraising for. And I think that it can be an Achilles heel for fundraisers if you go in with only one opportunity for a prospective donor to invest in your organization. And I completely agree, Kate, with what you said about expanding the pie. I look at the addition or the growth of capital needs as an expansion of that pie. It's giving organizations as well as frontline fundraisers more options to talk to donors. So if you have donors that are deeply committed to benevolent care, they're not going to stop giving to that just because you're also building a new healthcare center and are raising funds for that. They may talk about a blended gift so that they can support both of those priorities. And so it's giving yourself and your organization an opportunity to connect with more donors that may not have been interested in the past when the focus was smaller.
Well, we have done such a good job with marketing benevolent care. I mean, we have a $10 million endowment and quasi-endowment for benevolent care, and people know about that, and they always come to me and say, oh, I want to do something for that. And I say, well, you could, and you can never have too much money available. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. However, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? And just this week, I was talking with a donor who was setting up a $400,000 charitable trust, a new person moving in. He thought about benevolent care because he knew about it from one of the residents. And I said to her, you could do that. We'd welcome you to do that, but what about, for example, the unrestricted fund? And I talk about the grocery program and how the unrestricted fund gave us the ability to respond to needs that come up unexpectedly and that are urgent. Or with another resident in another community where they have wildfire risk, we could talk about how we use the unrestricted fund to match contributions from residents there to help with wildfire mitigation in their local community. So I'm trying to, educate the audience about what other things are possible in addition to benevolent care. And people are receptive to that. They just don't know about it.
Well, that's terrific, David. And what I hear the three of you saying is lean into diversifying the case for support. Don't be afraid of that. Be relational. And then, David, what I really love about what you just said is the importance of education, relationship building that leads to expanding people's horizons about the ways they can interact with the mission philanthropically. That's great stuff. We've got about 10 minutes left here, and I want to raise a question. And David, I'm going to start with you. And this is a very common issue that fundraisers face, and that is board participation in fundraising. So with your vast and deep experience, David, perhaps you could talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that you think are effective to getting board members to be more participatory in fundraising as donors and as volunteers?
Well, I'm pleased to say we have 100% participation by both of our boards, our foundation board and our corporate board, for philanthropy. So that is great. And they all are struggling. They all want to be involved. They want to be engaged. And the challenge is, there's no shortage of good ideas. There's a shortage of money and time to make those things happen. And so steering them in a way that's going to be useful for the organization and not going off on tangents around, some personal interests they might have is a challenge. And, it's part of that is the education component, like how can we most effectively deploy our resources, their resources, both financial and time and influence wise, to align with the needs of the organization. And we're going through a strategic planning process, preparing for 2022 post-recovery and getting them engaged in that whole process so they really understand the needs of the organization and how philanthropy can make a difference and how they can make a difference through their involvement.
So impact.
Absolutely, impact and alignment.
Ways that they can impact the mission. Kate and Irina, any quick comments from you on this?
Yeah, I think, from a practical standpoint, most people don't enjoy surprises, right? And I think that if I could flip a switch on fundraising and aging services today, it would be making being a donor a prerequisite for board service. And I know that sends a lot of people, falling off of their chair, but I think it's really critical to have those conversations up front, to make it clear what you're asking of someone when you're asking them to join your board. At Marts Lundy, we believe in permission-based fundraising, right? Hi, I'm raising money for a campaign. I'd like to talk to you about making a contribution to that. Is that okay? This is not about twisting arms and coercing people into giving you money. This is about, like I said before, making connections with people that are real and meaningful. And so I think when it comes to your board, the way that you respect them, the way that you respect their time, is by having a conversation with them up front about what it means to be a board member in good standing. What is typical on your board? And that's not setting arbitrary board giving thresholds. Right? That's not saying, well, every board member buys a ticket to our annual fundraiser and that's good enough, right? It's a conversation about, why are you even bothering to meet with me today about my organization? Why do you care about the welfare of older adults? Let's understand your interest in this first, and then maybe I can find a match between something that we need, something that you're passionate about, so that you're excited to give to our mission. It doesn't feel like an obligatory thing that you do because you're on the board. It's something that you look forward to every year, is having that conversation about what you're personally going to do in addition to your collective commitment as a board. So I just think preparation, early conversation is what's needed in the sector.
And I
That's
think
great.
the fundraising component is just one aspect of those early conversations, because to Kate's point about respecting your volunteers and not, having any surprises, talking with them about what they want to get out of board service and what the organization needs out of board service before they come onto the board, we feel is incredibly crucial. And, I don't have the hard data to back this up, but anecdotally, the organizations that we're seeing that are hitting that 100% board giving benchmark are the ones that have these board memos of understanding and board role descriptions, and making sure that everybody is on the same page before somebody is contributing their time, talent, or their treasure as part of board service.
Thanks, Irina. And before we leave this topic, could you comment on, and this can be self-administered, it doesn't have to be done through Marts Lundy. I'm wondering if you could just make a quick comment about the use of board climate surveys and how that could be an effective tool for fostering dialogue. I was asked that question in the Q&A box, and I thought it would be worthwhile to maybe have a little commentary on that as a group.
Sure. Well,
any thoughts on that?
It's pretty typical for a board to even conduct a self-assessment on a regular basis. And often that conversation is generated when there's a board vacancy and you realize you need to go out and recruit someone. And you might be asking yourself, well, what are the skill sets we're looking for? What might be the type of person we're looking for to build that board seat? But I do think that taking some time out and asking your board members, what do you think the expectation is for your own giving as a board member? What do you think the expectation is around your attendance at fundraising events, or your ability to go out and help us raise money by having conversations with capable donors? Those kinds of questions and reporting that information back to that board can generate some really wonderful discussion. We have done these numerous times with lots of aging services organizations, and it usually is the start of some major changes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Kate. I really appreciate it. And we have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more quick question, because with COVID-19, boy, the role of staff has just been magnified greatly, the gratitude for staff. And so there was a question about ways to successfully raise money for the benefit of staff. And I know we've heard numerous examples across our clients and so on throughout the year. Does anybody have a quick anecdote that you'd like to share on this? And again, recognizing we only have 30, 60, 90 seconds here, but.
I have a couple that come readily to mind, and David, I do want to give you an opportunity to talk about this too. But we have seen such creativity from the organizations that we've worked with over the past 10 months. I mean, everything from dollars raised for hazard bonuses, for example, to lunches delivered, to packages being sent home with staff of essentials like, pantry goods and toilet paper, including when that was in short supply. I mean, we've really seen organizations run the gamut of what it means to support their frontline staff during COVID-19. David, I'm curious if there's anything that you want to share from your experience with Sequoia Living, and Kate and Cedric, I want to give you a chance too as well.
Well, really, just the fact that the residents care so deeply for the staff, because the staff cares so deeply for them, and they really respond well. The residents want to support the staff, and we have scholarship funds available. We have emergency funds for unanticipated things that come up, like a death in the family. And many of our staff come from other countries, from Mexico, Latin America, the Philippines. And so the residents are very responsive to supporting the Employee Emergency Fund, Employee Scholarship Fund. And it really helps from a practical point of view in terms of employee retention, because those employees are very grateful that we respond to them in a time of need. During the pandemic, we've been providing housing for some of our employees who live in housing with a lot of other people, and they're at risk for being exposed. Perhaps someone in their house was exposed to COVID. So we put them up at a hotel for a couple of weeks and give them a per diem eat out, and that comes out of foundation funds, and we let the residents know we're doing that, and they are so grateful that we can help.
Well, this has been a terrific session. Thank you so much, David, for those comments. And someone just mentioned in the Q&A, which I think is exactly right, is the residents view staff as family. And these are very much communities. They are families. And speaking of family, I want to take a moment to once again thank our editorial review board. And when you see the report and it comes to you, please take note of those colleagues who were members of that editorial review board. They added so much nuance and color to this whole experience. I want to thank our panelists today. David, thank you so much for being part of this and on the editorial review board. Kate and Irina, Kate Harris and Irina Thompson, just a special shout out to both of you for all of the time and effort that you put into this project as co-editors. There's a whole phalanx of people behind Kate and Irina within Marts Lundy who are probably too numerous to mention here, but I want to acknowledge our colleagues internally, in particular, Lori, who's behind the scenes running this, and Leah O'Donnell, who's been instrumental throughout the year. You'll see on the screen here that on our thank you slide, you can contact us. We welcome that. We'd be happy to have more dialogue with all of you on this. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule today. Best of luck. Let's get through COVID-19 and away we go, fundraising 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.